Okay, good afternoon again, students of British and American culture. This will be round two for today since the Friday lecture was just done this morning. I'm going to continue on in chapter 4 from the beginning. We started with the hard fork, which is the word I decided to use to describe the separation between the different directions that the British and American culture went. Now, I think the reason this course is okay to teach, even though there's so much stuff to talk about, is that, of course, they did come from the same source. So you have to remember that some of these people, these famous people, Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson was younger, but Benjamin Franklin was basically a grandfather by the time independence was achieved. So most of his life he was a British person, and he considers himself British. He tried to keep the British Empire going as long as he could and have some sort of compromise about how the colonies would become a country and how they would operate within the British sphere of influence, but it didn't work out. So I know we're skipping ahead. So we've covered the 17th century, and we're going to have to go back and talk about, Thanksgiving and the natives and the conflicts and the disease and all that kind of stuff. But basically, I want to pick it up about right in the middle of the 18th century. There is a war fought between France and the United Kingdom, basically from the end of the 18th century, from the end of the 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century. So let's just get the dates straight before I mix them up. It's always confusing. 17th century is 1600s. So we ended with the Glorious Revolution. So the British, they're fighting against the French. Louis XIV, the Sun King, is trying to take over all of Europe, remember? And William, the Stadtholder, the Prince of Orange, the Stadtholder, of the Netherlands, becomes the King of England. He becomes William III, the Prince of Orange. And he uses the resources of England and the Netherlands together, and along with some allies from the other Protestant states in Germany, he manages to fight against Louis XIV and in a war, and it was a sort of a stalemate, and then he dies, and Queen Anne and the Duke of Marlborough, if you've heard the word Marlborough, it's probably because of the cigarettes, but there was a Duke of Marlborough, an ancestor of Winston Churchill. He was a great commander, and he commanded an army, a Protestant army that was led by the English, but was composed of a lot of people from different Northern European countries. And they defeated the French, and they won what in America is called Queen Anne's War. And then continuously through the 18th century, the French and the English came to over disputes of territories and political maneuvering and economic disputes, because they were basically running this mercantile system, which meant that the French were only trying to trade internally and make their products more competitive. And the British also tried to use this model as well. But eventually it came to, who was going to have the greater economic advantage through international trade and through control of colonies. And the war that resulted from these successive confrontations, political and economic confrontations in Europe, there was 7 wars that they fought, and the English won 5 of the 7. The last one is Napoleon. The last one is the French Revolutionary Wars is the second last one, and the last one is the Napoleonic Wars. And they did lose the Revolutionary Wars. France got bigger and bigger and built an empire, but that's in the future. So right now, basically what's happening is the British and the French are competing for territories all over the world. And so they start a world war between each other, between them and their allies. And England is allied with Prussia. And this is sort of a diplomatic revolution because Prussia was allied with France and Austria was allied with England, and they flip. And England, the United Kingdom, the British are allied with the Prussians, who are getting more and more powerful. And the Austrian Empire is starting to lose power and influence. So you end up with France with a weaker ally, and the British being better at naval warfare and fighting all over the globe, doing better than France is, and France focusing on Europe. So some of the battles go well for the French, but when they fight in India and they fight in North America and they fight in the Caribbean, this is really the first truly world war in history. It's called the 7 Years' War, even though it's not actually 7 years, it's 8 years. But we call it the 7 Years' War, and it was fought in the middle of the century. And the important thing for America is that the British fought the French in America. And the important thing for Canada is that a British general named General Wolfe attacks Quebec in New France and defeats the general Montcalm at Quebec City, and he takes Quebec City. As a consequence, at the end of the war, the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1753. 1763. I better look this stuff up. 1756 it starts. 1763 they sign the treaty. And in the treaty, the French have to give up some territory because they lose the war. There's a Treaty of Paris in 1783 at the end of the Revolutionary War, but the first one is in 1763. The war goes from 1756 to 1763, which is actually 8 years, if you count 56 and 63, okay? That's not important though, just remember that the name of it is 7 years. But in America, it is called the French and Indian War, because the French basically were outnumbered. They had a very small territory. They had a very big territory, but a very small population. They were outnumbered 10 to 1 by the English colonies in the 13 colonies. Despite that though, maybe because of that, they had a lot of native allies, which they referred to as Indians. And so they fought together against the British. And the natives fought because the French were not numerous and they were not taking all their territory, and they were trading with them, and they treated them better than the English. Basically because the English wanted the land. They were taking land and developing it because there were thousands and thousands more English colonists. So the British were a much bigger threat. So that was a natural alliance. But when the British took Quebec City and the war was ended, and the French signed the treaty in the terms, they were required to give up some territory because they were losing the war. So to end the war, they gave up New France, right? So that all of that territory where Toronto and Quebec and Montreal, and that huge piece of territory that's in Eastern Canada now, which was the original Canada, it became part of the British Empire. That happened in 1763. So this created an entirely new dynamic because the Dutch were gone. I think I mentioned that New York was New Amsterdam, and when the English took it over, they named it after James II. And so it was called New York. The state became New York, and the city became New York City. So the Dutch were gone. The Swedish had a very small colony going, and they were not competitive early on. So they were absorbed by the Dutch, and the Dutch were absorbed by the English. And now the French are out. They still have territory in the Caribbean. what is now Haiti was part of France, French territory. It was called Saint-Domingue. And people from Haiti do speak a type of French still. But Canada became British territory, became British North America. So they had to manage that, and then they started to move people in there to manage the French population. They actually deported thousands of French people out of Acadie all the way down to New Orleans and relocated them there, where they reestablished themselves as Acadiens, which turned into the word Cajun. So there was a French population in Louisiana, in the United States, down in the Gulf of Mexico, and the British government decided that there was too many French people to manage in Eastern Canada, so they deported them. Some of them went back to France, but some of them were relocated to Louisiana, and that's where you get Cajun culture from. They're descendants of people that were forcefully relocated from Eastern Canada, from parts of Quebec and New Brunswick. So this new situation means that America just has competition to the south. There's the Spanish Empire still controls everything from Texas to California to Mexico to Argentina. The Spanish Empire has a huge amount of territory and a huge population as well. But there's, on the eastern United States, what we call the Eastern Seaboard, it's just the English. It's just the British. So this actually creates a problem, because even though the British won, it was a really expensive war. And they borrowed, the government had to bankroll all of the equipment and the pay for the soldiers and the ships and the buildings and the damage, and trade was affected, and they had huge amounts of debt they had to pay, and they needed the money from somewhere. And they thought that since the Americans were protected by the British military, that they should also pay to maintain the British military. That makes sense, right? So this is how it all starts, is that actually from 1620, from the start of Jamestown and Plymouth, actually Jamestown starts a little bit earlier, but things start really to take hold in the 1620s. The first Thanksgiving is in 1621. And that's when, it doesn't look like the English are going to leave. Like, they're going to permanently settle there. And the natives, they attempt to remove them and attack them a few times after that, but they were never again really, there was never as good a chance as the early 1600s to just wipe out all of the English and make sure that they couldn't get a foothold in America. But by the 1700s, like I said, there are tens of thousands of English. There's all these different types of colonies. And we'll have to talk about, exactly, what type of colonies there were there. There were 13. It's going to be hard to remember all of them, but they all have different characteristics. What the important thing I want you to remember is Virginia, for example, was established by a company, and they were established in order to start a business. They were looking for gold. They ended up selling tobacco, and they ended up creating, sort of a business aristocracy. These rich people started to meet together and govern themselves. And it was called the Virginia House of Burgesses. And they started to pass laws and started to manage their own territory. In Pennsylvania, a person named William Penn was given the territory because Charles II didn't have enough money to pay the debt. So instead, he gave him this land, gave him a contract, a charter to establish a colony, and he called it Pennsylvania because Charles II insisted that he name it after his father, because that's who Charles II respected and owed the money to. William Penn was a Quaker, and so he believed in certain equality and religious freedom because he was not an Anglican. And so he established Pennsylvania and Philadelphia especially as a really kind of, it's called the Society of Jesus. They're supposed to be friendly and welcoming and non-violent. They turn into this group is not aggressive and doesn't use violence to solve problems. So they're pacifists, and Philadelphia rapidly becomes the largest city, even more attractive to live than New York City at the time. Philadelphia becomes the first city in the north. Georgia gets founded after King George, and they try to found it with having no slavery. But because of South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia using slaves for all their labor, they're not able to be competitive because they can't produce as much on their plantations without using slaves to work. So Georgia starts out as sort of having no government and having equality amongst all people, and slavery is illegal, but it gradually gets transformed into the same kind of plantation environment as South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia. Maryland is established by a Catholic, so there's a Catholic kind of influence there. New York used to be New Amsterdam, so there's all these people from all over the world. The Dutch are the best traders in the world in the 17th century, so it's all mixed. You walk down the street in New York and you can hear 20 different languages being spoken at the same time. So they all have these different characteristics. I don't think I'm up to 13 yet. I mentioned North Carolina and South Carolina. They all had their concepts. So they were not a group that was expected to turn into the United States. In fact, everybody thought, especially them, that they could never make a country together, that they all had different ideas about how they should be run, and the concepts were completely different. Some of the states are very small, like Delaware and Rhode Island. It's just because there was a group of people that didn't like the way, Pennsylvania was being, and Maryland were being managed or governed, so they broke away and made their own. Massachusetts is where the Thanksgiving event takes place, and that's where the Puritans go. And they have a certain way, as you know from us talking about Puritans, they're very serious about religion and about studying the Bible and about not having Christmas and all these other things. All these things have changed, but at the beginning, each colony had a very specific character. And the United States is still very diverse. You can't think of the United States as a place that's homogenous in any sense. You've got Hawaii, and you've got California and Texas and Florida and New York. Every state has a really distinct character. Some of them can be grouped together, definitely. They have similarities. But the original 13 at the time, they had as much diversity as they had as many differences as they had similarities, certainly. So basically the British government decides that they're going to tax, right? They're going to tax these colonists and citizens, but they make a huge mistake in not taking their participation in government seriously. And this completely aggravates the situation. It could have been handled, but Parliament they start trying to tax basically by these excise taxes. They're kind of like, they're acts that put tariffs, import-export taxes, and sales taxes on things. And they have these tax collectors who inspect. They inspect cargo, and they weigh everything, and they measure everything, and look at the amount of cargo, and then the traders, the merchants and the traders and importers and exporters and logistics cargo, companies that are American and British, they're supposed to pay. So pay the taxes. Nobody likes these taxes. That's why duty-free exists, right? And the Americans didn't have to pay them. They were some of the most lightly taxed people in the world. This is the thing that people should realize, is that Americans kind of overreacted, because if they were going to compare themselves to other places, they should have been taxed more. But basically, the British government had started these colonies and let them do what they wanted for over 100 years. And so all of these places had developed and they started governing them themselves and they started making their own laws, and they didn't believe that they should be controlled by a king and a group of people on the other side of the ocean who had nothing in common with them. And they shouldn't be sending governors to control them, because they didn't. In the beginning, one of the benefits of colonizing America the way they did is to individuals and groups and religious, like the Puritans, took it upon themselves. They gave them permission to do it, but then they didn't support them. They didn't pay them. Virginia was a company, and it was supported by the crown after King James, took their charter away, and it became a crown colony. And Georgia became a crown colony too. But most of them developed themselves. They started to become more and more independent naturally. And it was a benefit to the British government. The British Empire could just, gain the trade benefits from getting the resources and not worry about too much about managing them. There's not very much government cost. But when the French started attacking the colonies and then they required protection, there was a huge military cost. And that's what they were trying to cover now. So suddenly they were trying to control all of these colonies and impose their control by taxes and by sending representatives of parliament to collect the money. And this is where the expression, no taxation without representation, comes from, right? So let me read this to you so that I can get it right without any mistakes. So, who were the men that insisted on separating from the empire, and who drove this effort to establish the first modern democracy? How did this long shot finally come to fruition? It was a long and arduous process before it finally reaped the seeds of rebellion and revolution to emerge as a newly minted independent republic, defeating the British Empire on its own land and on its own terms. There were many reasons for the victory of the colonists and the continental armies, but before the trends and forces are discussed any further, one factor is the leaders. And when you watch the please watch the Matt Cook video, you will see he puts a very dark, perspective on the leadership, which most Americans consider these people their heroes. But we can start out by saying most of the founding fathers were slave owners, right? And one of the most contentious things about American history, and how one of the most negative effects on its society, has been the problem from the beginning that slavery developed into a society of fear and paranoia, as he says. There's so many slaves, they outnumber their owners, and it's not a natural state for human beings to be in. It says that right in the Constitution, that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson wrote that, but he's a hypocrite because he had a plantation with slaves too. George Washington was one of the richest people in North America. Yes, he served in the Continental Army and he was the general of the United States. He's given 5 stars now. He's a 5-star general, afterwards. They gave him that honor. But he didn't take a salary. Donald Trump didn't take a salary either. Not that they're related. He's no George Washington. But the achievements that he had have to be compared to the lifestyle that he had and his motivations. As George Washington aged, I think he started to get a better sense of what American society was going to be like. And in his will, he set free the slaves he owned personally. And that's something that people consider, sort of a recovery of his reputation. But, there's only so much you can do to erase, or you can't erase what the society was based on and what it was like before. So one of the things that was a problem from the beginning, and what made the British think that the colonies would never unite over anything, was the fact that some of them were slave societies. Okay, having slaves was not illegal in the States. The northern states had slaves too, but very few. But in the South, you you're having like 2-to-1 ratio slaves to people in South Carolina or higher. And they begin over time to realize that there's a real danger of these slaves, rebelling and trying to make themselves free. They don't, of course, want to live forever in that condition. And their children are slaves too. So they start making law after law after law in order to control this huge population. It ends up being, by the Civil War, millions, right, of Africans that are displaced. And some of them have been there for several generations, like their parents were slaves and their grandparents were slaves. So you can understand how these people, all of them wanted to be free. And the only way to keep them from being free was this really paranoid, restrictive law-based society that was prepared at any time for a dangerous, rebellion to emerge from amongst their workers. It must have been a very uncomfortable relationship to have, to own another human being and know that secretly they just, some masters didn't treat their slaves badly, but that doesn't matter. They still want their freedom, even if they're being treated fairly. It doesn't matter. The all human beings would suffer under those circumstances, at least mentally. If they weren't being treated badly physically, they had to deal with the reality that they couldn't make their own choices, right? They were always limited and they were always considered property. And that was not a condition that could be permitted. Thomas Jefferson seems to have realized this and putting it in the Declaration of Independence, in the documents that turned into the American Constitution. But in order to keep all the colonies together, there had to be a compromise. And that compromise created a divide in opinion and serious social issues that would not be solved ever. The problem continues now. People are being killed over the same systemic points of view. Slavery doesn't exist anymore, but treating people as secondary human beings does. So this is a very important part of the course. We're going to come back to it though. So we have to talk about Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are the three that I chose as representative of the group. And we have to talk about the Declaration of Independence, of course. But really what you need to know for now, until I think I'll stop here because I've done a lot of lecturing today and it's a lot to absorb. I'll save this for the end of the week. I'll start talking about the main figures and the important people that influence the American Revolutionary War, and we'll finish the chapter, finish chapter 4 on Friday's lecture. So we'll keep that part of the chapter for that lecture. Okay? And for now, remember that the war between France and England set up this situation where the British tried to assert their authority in the colonies, which was protested against. No taxation without representation. Benjamin Franklin actually went over to the United Kingdom and represented the colonies to try and discuss how things could be worked out. But as I told you before, there was kind of an escalation. So at first there was grumbling, and then there was, discussion, talking, letters being sent, complaining, and then there were protests, and then there was activity, and then there were, there was the Boston Tea Party. They threw all the tea that had been delivered by the East Indian Tea Company into the Boston Harbor, and they threw it all in the harbor. And then Boston went into military lockdown. But we'll save for that's the start of the process of the actual, rebellion. Once you start damaging property, rioting, and doing more than just protesting, through diplomacy they were sending Benjamin Franklin in order to protest and to negotiate, but that broke down completely. So then they started to gather to gather resources, and people started to be active. They started to be violent. They started to damage things, and it escalated until there was a full-blown rebellion, a revolt, just like the peasants' revolt. But unlike the peasants' revolt, the king is not going to be able to put this down. He's not going to be able to kill the leader and disperse all of the people who have armed themselves. Instead, there's going to be another long war, which the French will participate in. This is one of the wars that the French win, is that they will jump in and help the Americans earn their freedom through battle and military defense of their territory. Like I said, I'll explain about the leadership and about the Revolutionary War and about what happens right after the American Revolution. And that will be on Friday's lecture of this week. No quiz this Friday. The next quiz will be the week after this week. Whatever date that ends up being, that's going to be, let me just double check. We'll have 3 weeks in a row. We're going to have quizzes. So this week you'll have the week off, and then there'll be quiz number 4 on the 14th, quiz number 5 on the 21st, and quiz number 6 on the 28th. And then we'll have a week to wrap things up, and then we'll have the exam. That's how it is. Like I said, the assignments need to be graded, and you'll have to do one more assignment. I'll tell you about that once I've given you your grades for the one you just finished. Thank you everyone for listening, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. See you on Friday.